My name is Joe Brummer. I am a speaker and author and trainer on trauma-informed restorative practices, and I'm also the author of the book, which is surprisingly sitting in front of me. I didn't expect it to be Building a Trauma-Informed Restorative School, which I wrote with Marg Thorsborn from Australia. And I'm going to tell you a quick story, and I'm just going to warn you before I tell this story that it's about trauma, and so it is a little bit it can be disturbing, and so I want to just be braced for that. It's not terrible, don't worry. But this is how I got here. This is little me there on the left. Little me, unfortunately, was the survivor and at the time victim of traumatizing childhood. I had some very abusive parents who thought that things like burning our hands were good punishment. And while that was happening, it made me a pretty awkward kid. So I was an easy target for bullies. I was a small kid, and so I was even bullied more. And I was also 2 years ahead in age from all my peers and 2 years behind in my classes because of the where my birthday fell and uh, and getting left back in second grade. And so I ended up having, from second grade on, I'm older than all the kids that I'm with in school, which again makes for more awkwardness and targeting of bullying. And what I've learned about trauma is that when children are traumatized, it tends to make them see red flags where they don't exist and not see red flags where they do, which honestly means as they get older, traumatized kids tend to grow up and unfortunately sometimes put themselves in tough situations because, again, they don't see the red flags that say danger, or they do see them where they actually don't exist. And for me, that actually led to me being the victim of two separate violent crimes about 10 years apart. I unfortunately was gay bashed twice and pretty violently almost killed. And so the silver lining of all of that is the guy you see in that picture standing with me is also the person who took me to the hospital after my second gay bashing. And um, well, somebody's going to take you to the hospital and spend the whole night sitting with you. I would suggest that you marry them. And so 22 years ago, I married that guy because he took me to the hospital, and I'm still with him. So we've been together all this time. But it's with that love and support that put me on this journey of becoming a mediator, getting involved in community mediation, getting involved in restorative justice, and then also getting involved in mental health, where I really learned about what trauma, the impacts of trauma on children, which caused me to sort of want to combine restorative justice with trauma informed principles. And I say that because there's a contingency of people out there that believe restorative justice on its own is trauma informed. And I just want to say for the record, it's not. Restorative practices, restorative justice cannot be trauma informed unless they see behavior through a lens of neuroscience rather than a lens of behaviorism. The whole punishment reward, kids are using their behavior to either get something or get out of something. But that's just not reality. Kids don't have enough executive function in their brain to be that strategic. And so the reason I tell you this whole story is not one so you'll be like, wow, this guy's gone through a lot. It's because it proved resilience is possible, that people can go through severe traumatic events and still heal and be okay. Somehow I've managed to hold together a really long-term relationship. I've managed to have a really good career. I've managed to publish a book, and that's despite a pretty violent and abusive childhood, along with two violent crimes. And so as you listen to this information about children and trauma, one of the things I want you to really understand as you walk away from this is that it's not, kids are not damaged by trauma. They're changed by trauma, but that doesn't make them damaged. It means that they need a little extra care and support and relational health to survive. And so with that said, Let's define what we mean by trauma. So when we were going to say we're going to do a trauma-informed school, let's talk about what trauma is and what trauma isn't. Trauma is not the events we go through. It's actually our body's response to those events. It's a way of separating out stress from the stressor. The stressor is the event. The stress is your response to the event. In cases of trauma, it is where events overwhelm our nervous system beyond our ability to cope. SAMHSA, here in the United States, uh, gives us sort of a way of thinking about trauma, which we call the three E's: the event, the experience, and the effects. Two people can go through the same event, have completely different experiences, therefore have different effects. With that known, we can start to understand why some people will go through an event and walk away really seriously impacted, or someone else can go through that exact same event and walk away kind of scot-free. And so the idea of understanding how trauma impacts the body. And so let's give you sort of the idea really quickly of how does trauma impact the body. And so it starts off with our brain. Your brain has four basic layers to it. Your brainstem, which is completely developed by the time you're born. Your cerebellum, which is your movement center, that's usually going to start being fully developed around 18 months, 2 years old. Your limbic system, which fully develops by adolescence. And then your cortex, which, wait for it, your cortex doesn't finish developing until you're about 30 years old. Here's what those things do. Now, a couple things I want you to know about these layers. One, every one of them can throw you into action. Two, every one of them can hold memory. And so every piece of information that comes into this layer it's got to go in a sequential order. And so the way our brains process information isn't from frontal cortex to frontal cortex, where our higher order thinking happens. It's that information goes from our cortex to someone else's brainstem, and then it has to work its way up to get to the cortex. And so our brainstems are basically the center of our fear and stress response. So our fear systems, our fight flight responses all live in our brainstem. And it's also the part of our body that maintains sort of our blood pressure, our heart rate, our sleep, all that stuff gets controlled by your brainstem. It's a little less neuroplastic and malleable. In other words, it's not going to change a whole bunch after it develops. Your cerebellum is actually your memory of movement. It's what controls motor function, your affect, your appetite, your sleep is also affected, your motor regulation. Your cerebellum also holds memory of movement. It's body memory. And so muscle memory, that's all. So you can hold memory within your body. And so young kids who experience trauma, especially before accessing language, um, they may not remember in linear memory or biographical memory events. They can't recall them like a movie, but their body can remember them. And because every experience we have gets remembered and somehow programmed into our system, whether or not it's safe, whether or not it's not safe, it's a threat, it's not a threat, this is how we create our blueprint. Our worldview is created by all of the experiences we have. And so as we move up this system, we'll get to our limbic system. This is the system in our bodies that allows us to be relational. It allows us to be human in the sense that we can attune to each other. It actually helps us to be in relationship with another person and literally attune to each other. In some cases, when we're with each other and co-regulating and really connected, our heart rates will align. And this is the part of our brain that allows that to happen. It's also Uh, the next up on this list is our cortex. This is where all of our higher functions live. It's our belief systems, our values. Uh, it's where the parts of our brain that allow us to process punishments and rewards and consequences. It's where we do math and language. It's even where we recognize faces. And this part of the brain shuts down under stress. And so as information comes into the brain from the bottom, it has to go from the bottom to the top. That's the only way our brains function, from the bottom to the top. Now, we can regulate our bodies and our brains from the top down or from the bottom up. And here's why that's kind of interesting. When stuff comes into our brain from the outside world, which is our five senses, or it comes from our inside world, the messages our body sends us about being hungry, being tired, being thirsty, all those messages come to the bottom of the brain and get compared to the memory that's hiding out in that layer. And so first it's going to come to the brainstem. And so the information comes in, and if the room's really, really, really hot, your brainstem's going to put you into action to get out of that room or cool you back down. Then the information is going to come up to the cerebellum where movement lives. And it's going to compare it to all the movement you've ever done before and decide, is this good or bad? Is it a threat? And it's going to respond. Then it's going to go up to your limbic system. This is our emotional brain where literally our feelings live. And it's going to compare it to the times we've had these things before. And again, look for threat. Then it's going to come up to our cortex. And so when kids are in school acting out, misbehaving, not meeting expectations, teachers often think, look, he knows the rules, he knows the expectations, and he's choosing to not follow the rules. And that would be a top-down way of thinking. In order for a child to make those kind of choices, it would have to come from the cortex. But your brain's not wired that way. Our brains are wired to literally function from the bottom up, which means we're programmed to act before we think. I know everyone says you should think before you act, and I agree, but your brain isn't programmed that way. Your brain is actually programmed to act before you think. Under stress and duress, our brains will actually lose the ability to problem solve. So you can take a person whose IQ is 135, and under stress and duress, their IQ will come down to about a problem solving skill of 105. That's a significant drop, and it can happen immediately, which means you can take a really smart person, put them under stress, and they lose the access to their smartness. Making sense so far, right? Why does this matter? It means that the current neuroscience bucks up against what we've thought about children's behavior for hundreds of years. That we see children misbehaving and we think they're making poor choices. But oftentimes it's their bodies reacting reflexively to threat. They go into fight, flight, freeze, faint. And those behaviors come from dysregulation. When our core systems are not balanced, which means you're slept, you are well fed, you feel safe and relational, then you can have access to your higher order thinking. So think of it as regulate, relate, reason. In order for us to get to the cortex and higher order thinking, we've got to follow this sequential order of processing, which means kids have to be regulated, relational, and then they can learn. But often in our schools with behavior problems, we jump right to reason. Why'd you do that? Why aren't you following the rules? Do this reflection sheet and tell me why, what your behavior was about. We jump right to reason, but we don't regulate and relate. And so it ends up not working, which is why punishments and rewards fail on kids who've been exposed to trauma. I would argue they fail for every kid, but definitely kids who've been exposed to trauma, because under stress and duress, they can't process punishments and rewards. And so let's talk about what traumas look like. So possible sources of trauma. So remember, these are the events. It's not what these are what can cause the response that becomes trauma. So separation from a parent or caregiver, disruptive home life, homelessness, which by the way, homelessness in schools doesn't look like what you think it looks like. We picture like people on the streets, but sometimes kids in schools are homeless, um, couch surfing on their friends' couches, staying in shelters, multiple families staying in a small place where kids don't have their own space. So homelessness doesn't always look like what you think it does. Childhood illness, either for the child that is ill or for their siblings whose parents are now distracted and not giving them the same parent time. Poverty, human trafficking, divorce, adverse childhood experiences, bullying, domestic violence, even and so some of these I'll point out is that oftentimes we think of traumatic events as the stuff that happens outside of school. But I also want you to consider racism, homophobia, uh, ableism, where kids who have neurodiversities are treated like they're less than, and oftentimes school becomes their source of trauma because schools don't always know how to manage uh, difficult behaviors from kids who are trying to use their behavior to communicate with us that they are not okay. And so we look at things like a death in a family, mental illness, frequent moves if you're a military kid, and every school year it's a new school army base or military base. And so you have new friends, new expectations, new surroundings every year. Those things are going to take a toll on a kid's development of how that brain that I just showed you, how this develops is based on all the experiences that you've had. When these happen to us, especially at younger ages, and so oftentimes we hear people say, well, it happened to them when they were so young. Thank God they won't remember. But their bodies remember. Our bodies hold trauma. And it's work. The younger you are, the more malleable your brain, the more damage that can do into the development of a brain. The more changes and adaptations that are maladaptive that will happen from those kind of changes. And so keeping in mind, we're also just coming out of collective trauma. Collective trauma is where we as a big whole in large groups go through traumatic events. COVID-19, a pandemic, political unrest, a war, natural disasters, hurricanes. I believe half of California was on fire. Colorado had fires. These are also trauma, but they're collective trauma because they're not just happening to one of us, they're happening to groups of us. And so those also have an impact on the development of a growing brain. And so what are the impacts? And why does it matter to schools to have an eye on this? And so when kids have never been exposed to trauma, they can be curious. They can feel safe. They're probably going to be relational with the people around them because they believe those people are safe. They're going to have more access to their cortex, which is where empathy lives, thinking rational, problem solving, having the ability to process time. All that stuff lives in the higher parts of our brain. But under stress and duress, you don't have access to that. It shuts down. And so in a trauma impacted brain, not going to have access to top-down regulation. So kids are going to be impulsive. They're not going to be able to hold their tongue. They're going to blurt stuff out they didn't mean to blurt out. They're going to be frustrated, unable to process the consequences. Punishments and rewards, they won't be able to connect the punishment to the action. Uh, they won't be able to process time. So time is a function of our frontal cortex, which means there's no such thing as later. There's no such thing as yesterday. There's right now, because the threat is in front of me right now. And since that threat's in front of me, well, I can't do math right now. I can't empathize with other kids in my class. I can't give you the answer to the question you asked, because that part of my brain is shutting down. So if we're going to get kids to learn, we got to follow the sequence of the brain: regulate, relate, reason. We need to be able to make sure that our kids are in atmospheres where they can feel safe, relational, and then we can do that higher order thinking. And so that becomes the question, all right, how do we do this? And so let me put it this way. When kids are in a state of fight, flight, freeze, faint, it shows up as behavior. Because children use behavior in school as a way of communicating to us that they're not okay. And so let's look at behaviors, common behaviors in school that look like fight. Fight looks like fight, right? Uh, Talking back to your teacher, throwing things around the room, flipping a desk. It looks like fight, except when it doesn't, because you'll notice the word silliness on that list. So during the experience of fight, flight in our nervous systems will give us a big burst of serotonin, a chemical in our brain it's the happy chemical. It makes you happy. It gives you a big burst of like uplifted feelings. And our bodies do this so we'll care about the threat. If you don't care about that test you got to take on Monday, you're probably going to fail it because you just don't care. But if the body gives you a little burst of serotonin, then you'll care about the threat enough to pay attention to it. And so it also can give a 10-year-old boy the giggles when you talk about an uncomfortable situation. And so sometimes children who have been experiencing trauma, they're the ones that giggle when they get in trouble. They giggle when they're uncomfortable. And we think it's them not taking things seriously, when in reality, it's because they're taking things seriously. Then we have flight behaviors. They look like flight behavior: getting kicked out of class, walking out of class, running. I know if any of you are educators in the room, you know you've probably met an eloper, the kids that run out of class and try to book on home, and with an array of educators running after them. But we also have flight behaviors that don't always look like flight. One, earphones and headbuds. I mean, yeah, headphones and earbuds. Twist those around. Headphones and earbuds are another one. So two things. One, many of the kids we see walking around with headphones and earbuds aren't playing any music. They're using the noise canceling features of their headphones to block out sensory perception, because trauma can impact the way children process sensory information: light, sounds, smells. Those things can all be evocative cues that engage the nervous system. They're triggers. And when kids are triggered, their nervous system's going to go into fight or flight. Some kids have learned that if they put on their headphones and block out the sensory information, they won't get triggered. Autistic kids, we do this for autistic kids because of sensory disorders already. But for many of our kids, they're doing it for themselves. And so we think, oh, that kid's breaking the rules wearing the earbuds, when in reality, that kid's just taking care of himself. The same thing, the second piece about earbuds and headphones is they communicate to something, to everyone else. Leave me alone. Go away. And so sometimes our kids are wearing headphones and earbuds, not because they're listening to music, but because they're sending a message: I don't want to talk. Which again, that's flight behavior in many cases. How are we doing here? Yeah, I hear that one. Veteran with PTSD. This is exactly what I hear that one. I absolutely, I being a guy that lives with PTSD, I'm right there with you. I very often have headphones in that don't play any music or anything. I love noise canceling earbuds because they can leave me a whole bunch calmer. Then when we jump into, there's one more on that flight one that I'll name off, and that's the hovering student. So some younger students, we'll say elementary school students, in their flight nervousness, they will attach themselves to a teacher and then just lock themselves next to the teacher. That teacher walks around the room, that kid's going to follow them, talking a mile a minute and trying to make up reasons to talk to their teacher. Oh, Mrs. Smith, are we having a test today? I really want to go to a test today. Or what are we doing to after school? And what they're really doing is trying to keep themselves feeling safe by attaching themselves to an adult. And then the adult's like, what's up with this kid, man? Why are you following me around? And the reality is that kid is actually trying to run from something, but to that adult. So we often think of flight behavior as running away. Sometimes it's running to feel that feeling of safety. Our brains are programmed to look for safety. In other words, we have something called neuroception, which your brain is constantly scanning the room, looking around for cues of safety and regulation. And so even, I wonder how many, even while you're asleep, your brain is still scanning the room and looking for places where there might be danger. And so if you've ever woken up at like 3 in the morning, like wide awake, and you're like, oh my God, what's going on? What might be behind that is your brain has detected a threat. And so for many of our kids, when those threats are detected and they go into fight or flight, it's because they've scanned the room. And again, they see red flags where there are none, and they don't see red flags where they are. And so they can misread their neuroception. In other words, they've got faulty neuroception and they see threats and will go into these behaviors to tell teachers, I'm not okay. All the way up to what we call freeze, blank stares, head on the desk, not talking. Kids might have that glassy look in their eyes. By the way, that goes for adults too. In some cases, students have been known, and children themselves are natural people pleasers. And so trauma can put people into a mode of being people pleasers. Technically, this is called feign slash fawn. And what it really means is that children will try to befriend their threat. They figure, I can't outrun this. I can't fight this. I might as well try to befriend the threat so it won't hurt me. And so you often see this in kids that have been bullied, where they keep trying to become friends with their bully so that the bully won't hurt them anymore. Of course, we all know that doesn't work. It actually makes kids get bullied more, but it's the stress response that's causing them to do that. Kids are not strategically doing this. It is strategic, but they're not doing it from the cortex. They're doing it from a stressed space in the lower parts of the brain. So what do we do in a school? We bring in things like universal precautions. So it's a weird thing to say after a pandemic, but in order to stop spreading disease from one person to another, medical folks wear masks, gloves, gowns. They wash their hands between every patient. The assumption is we don't know who's got an infectious disease, so let's treat everyone like they have an infectious disease so we don't accidentally spread it. We need that same concept in classrooms. We don't know which kids have trauma, and scary enough, we don't know when. So maybe on Monday, little Johnny was great, but by Tuesday, not so much. And so we have to take precaution that every kid in our classroom has trauma and has been exposed to trauma. And so those precautions can be things like no yelling at kids, no sarcasm with kids, making sure that classrooms are sensory sensitive, making sure that we understand that children's bodies are sensitive, and so that we can create classroom environments that are less likely to trigger that kid's fight or flight systems, triggering that stress response. And so some universal precautions I'll throw out there are the things like no yelling, no clip charts or public shaming, uh, making sure that we don't touch anyone without asking permission, because touch is not soothing for everyone, and making sure we connect with children before correcting their behavior. Find out what that behavior is about before you start trying to correct it. And so, let me check in my time here. The way that I've been doing this work for the past few years is to go into schools and uh, I'm doing what I call an integrated implementation or a blended implementation. And yes, you will absolutely receive this PowerPoint. Um, if anybody needs it, and more, if you need more resources, I'm your guy. I will hook you up. Um, I'm doing the equity work, restorative justice work, mindfulness work in schools, trauma informed principles, mixed with Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication and Ross Green's work around collaborative and proactive solutions, so that we're collaboratively problem solving children's behavior with children. One of the things that we do as a mistake with children is we try to solve their problems without them, which means we have uninformed, unilateral solutions to problems that don't actually help kids. Why? We didn't ask the one person involved in the problem, the kid. And so, as young as possible, and you could do this with really young children, we need to collaboratively work on their behavior and come up with solutions to their behavior that include the voice of children. Now, the way we do things, a bunch of adults get into a room, theorize about what's wrong with this kid, and then make a plan, a behavior plan that's never gotten the voice of a child. I'm not a big fan of that one. And so I'm a really big fan of Ross Green's work around using collaborative and proactive solutions so that we teach, so we figure out what skills a kid is lagging and how do we build those skills in that kid, and do that all from a lens of being trauma informed. I believe to do that, we're going to need some skills. And so in my book, I named what I call the 5 skills of restorative. Whether you call that practices or justice, I'm not really sure. Um, yes, I love that. And I love that somebody just put Mona Delahook's name up there. I'm going to stop looking at that chat so it doesn't distract me. um, so the 5 skills that I really go for people are: one, empathy. We need teachers to know, and educators that work with, plus I think anyone that works with children needs to know multiple ways of listening. So in this work, we teach active listening, reflective listening, and empathic listening. All of those are different, and all of them work differently at different times with different age groups. Like reflective listening does not work well with teenagers, but it works really, really well with younger elementary school children. Elementary school children don't do really well with active listening, but they can do really well with empathic listening. Like when we really know how to listen at the right time in the right way, we can make our empathy stronger. And kids need empathy to be validated, to feel heard, to belong. We also use honest expression, and sometimes in restorative practices, we call those effective statements. I'm not a big fan of the effective statements that are being sold out there. I'm not a big fan of I statements. The whole like, those usually turn out to sound a lot like, I feel because you did, which is still blame. It's your fault, is how people hear that. And so I fall back into Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, observation, feeling, need, request. And so that instead of I because you, it's I because I. We also use that to move people away from praise, because what we know about children who've experienced abuse and neglect is that praise is often part of that abuse. And so it can be a trigger for nervous system responses and stress responses in children who've experienced abuse. And so we want to move educators away from praise, which, by the way, is not that helpful to start with, and trade it off for gratitude. Don't tell the kid you're thinking about him. Tell how you're feeling that is positive. And again, there's a lot more about that in my book, so I know that's a hard one for a lot of adults. But praise doesn't really help children the way you think it does. And so um, questions are the next one. I have found that adults are not the greatest problem solvers for questions. I learned that a lot when I started doing mediation trainings, and I realized that a lot of young new mediators just didn't know how to ask questions. We had to go, really train them to ask good questions. I've also learned that teachers and adults don't know how to problem solve with children. And so we work on that problem solving questioning for adults. And then we do the art of request, which is how do we solve problems restoratively, come up with action plans that make things right, and then add mindfulness into that. Um, we have an expanded continuum of restorative practices that we bring into schools, all put through the trauma-informed lens. So everything from mindfulness to restorative language, all the way up to restorative circles and conferencing. You'll notice in the very middle of this screen is the word student involvement. I don't think you can effectively become a trauma-informed restorative school if your students aren't part of that equation. You can't do this for them or to them. You have to do it with them. And so student involvement, student circle keepers, peer mediators, we need students to be involved in creating a restorative trauma-informed culture. Um, and then I'm going to leave you with a little bit of hope here. So, for the past like couple of, 4 or 5 years, we've had a tough look at education. It just seemed like education was going down a hole that was getting scarier and scarier by the minute. I was really honored that my good friend Miguel Cardona became Secretary of Education for the United States. Not only is Miguel Cardona our Secretary of Education, I personally work with this guy to help implement restorative justice in schools and trauma informed in schools. He's one of us. He is a guy that cares about equity. He cares about restorative justice and believes in restorative justice. He believes in trauma informed schools and he believes in student voice. So the money and funding that he used to pay me to work in his schools when he was here in Connecticut came from student voice grants. And so this guy, he's on our side. And with all that said, this is how you can find me on Twitter. If you so want to do that in your world, you may do that. And so hopefully I left enough time for some questions. And I see one that's in the chat that says, can you touch on the distinction between transformative and restorative practice and values? And my answer would be, I'm not sure what you mean by that. So I'm going to say probably not. Um, if you want to, let me dump this screen share real quick. If you want to ask that question and give me a little detail of what you're asking me, I bet I could try to answer it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, it's Andrea. I think that a lot of the values and practices that you're outlining and some of the things you said today are starting to be more outlined as transformative justice, simply on some level from my understanding, is that because restorative implies that we're restoring something to some other former state. And transformative is that we're actually creating something new and creating something that upholds transformation on all different levels, on the systemic, the individual, the school. So the scholarship and the language that's being used in a lot of scenarios is definitely restorative, but then also starting to move into this idea of transformative justice. So that's what I was touching on a little bit.
Yeah. This might not land on a lot of people, but it might land on some. I know that there are a lot of people who put time and energy into whether is it restorative justice or restorative practices. Is it transformative justice or community justice or restorative justice? And those are worthwhile conversations. They're just not ones that I entertain. I think there are 1,000 things in my world that I put my energy into, and that's not personally been one of them. So it's hard for me to answer those questions because I personally don't spend too much time. Um, I just don't spend a lot of time thinking about the differences between transformative or restorative, because in my underlie, what they really mean, are we meeting human beings' needs and are we taking care of their humanity? I honestly don't know I don't care what you call it. What I want you to do is do it. Take care of people's humanity, honor their humanity, let children grow. And so that's probably not the world's most popular answer, but I, I sometimes love that people do those conversations, and then sometimes I get very frustrated with those conversations. So I tend to just avoid them, to be totally honest. But yeah, you're probably right. It probably does lean more towards what people have named transformative justice. I actually usually use the word restorative as a catch-all for restorative practice, restorative justice. And so that's, Yeah, I hope that's okay.
Yeah, thank you
Uh,
so much for that. Thank you.
you're welcome. Uh, uh, Other big questions, thoughts, comments? I'll even take sarcasm. Awesomeness. So I guess since I have a couple seconds, I'm going to give you a thought to send you off with, and there are questions. Please pop in there. Um, right now, our restorative justice work in schools has been sold to schools as some sort of form of alternative to suspension, alternative discipline programs. And unfortunately, many of those programs still see children's behavior and are responding, quote unquote, restoratively, but they're using behaviorism. They're still seeing, even if they're not using punishments, many people out there are still combining restorative practices with things like PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports, or other behaviorism uh, motions. And the problem is, those are never going to be trauma informed. So if you've taken restorative practices and combined them with behaviorism, which is like PBIS, responsive classroom, a lot of these behaviorism based systems, you're never going to be a trauma informed school because, one, those things are not equitable. So behaviorism is never going to be equitable. And so think of it this way: when we're punishing and rewarding behavior, the punishments and rewards are neutral, but the behavior you are punishing and rewarding is not. It's cultural. And so oftentimes it is a bunch of white people deciding which behaviors do we reward, which ones do we punish. And unfortunately, that's a hidden way that we are pushing very easily things like white supremacy. So I really want you to leave here thinking about when you're going to put restorative practice into a school, are you doing it through a trauma informed neuroscience lens, or are you doing it through behaviorism? Because if you're doing it through behaviorism, it's never, you can do restorative practices, but it's never going to be trauma informed. And so I want people to, and hopefully that stirred up some stuff in the adults listening to this, and hopefully it excited the kids listening to this, because we have to stop looking at how we reward and punish behavior, because which behaviors we punish and which ones we reward, that stuff's not neutral. It's cultural, and it. I just want you to keep getting that in your heads. All right, I'll get my soapbox. What is the role of PBIS in our schools, if any? I can't say that I know much about California schools and PBIS, but I know nationally PBIS is grounded in many, many schools. There is a large push out there, especially from the trauma informed schools movement and the neuroscience movement. I noticed somebody mentioned Mona Delahook. She is one of those voices out there that is pushing people to move away from things like class dojos, clip charts, point systems, demerit systems. Um, PBIS systems where kids get behavior bucks, all that stuff. That stuff is down. It's not good for kids with diversity or neurodiversity issues. It's like ADHD, dyslexia, autism. It's definitely not good for brown and black children because it's disproportionately punishing them. These systems are really, not great. Is there a quick checklist or guide to ensure restorative versus other plus restorative? Yes, although checklists should only be used to help guide training, but in the back of my book, there actually is a trauma-informed schools checklist that's broken up into a couple sections to help people really shape their school plans to implement this work. Because it takes a good 3 to 5 years to really transform a school or a school district. Um, Yeah, and absolutely. You guys can have my contact information. I will. It's pretty simple. I'll say it at the same time I'm writing it in the chat for you. My email is joe@joebrummer.com. Throw that in the chat for you. And my website, which you can also go to. Not that there's anything really there to, there's articles. And there's also my website, joebrummer.com. And you're all welcome to contact me if you have questions, it's something you didn't want to ask in front of everybody else today, or you need resources. And I will absolutely make sure that the PowerPoint gets sent to the conference presenters. I have to admit that I've been in training all week here, and I was with the school district all day today. And so I finished my PowerPoint just about 5 minutes before I got onto this call. And so I would have sent it earlier, but didn't have time. So thanks for having me. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you,
Joe.
Joe. I know you had a really long day. I appreciate you.
Thank you.